So the book of Job, which you just read, is considered to be one of the oldest books in the Bible. The exact dates in the book are not provided, but clues within the story suggest that Job lived before the time of Moses, around the time of Abraham and Isaac, which is approximately 2,000 years before Christ. So we are reading a story here today that is 4,000 years old or more. It's amazing when you think about it, isn't it? Now, I've taught on Job a few different times throughout my ministry, but to provide a little bit of background to our passage, Job is considered part of what we call in the Old Testament the wisdom literature. And it's to be read then alongside books like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, the other books in the wisdom category. And together they're intended to call the reader to reflect on the deeper truths of life and the way a person ought to live, which is really what wisdom is. It deals with the ought, how we ought to live as we carry through this world. Now, Job, as you may know, deals with the problem of suffering and pain and how we live and ought to live in a world that oftentimes, as we all know, seems quite unfair. Job, the main character, is a man of great righteousness and great wealth for that matter. But in the opening chapters, we read as this man loses everything, his wealth, his health, his family, through a test that's permitted by God, but instigated or carried out by Satan. He's sick now and he's destitute. And the book records then a back and forth dialogue between 3 and then eventually 4 so-called friends. And they accuse Job of being afflicted by God due to some sin or unrighteousness. And they urge him over and over that he should curse God and die. But Job, in his defense, argues that he has not committed any sin that would be deserving of this lot in life, that he has maintained a life of righteousness. And then through these poetic dialogues, Job then voices both despair and deep faith, culminating in our passage today, where Job voices his hope for this living Redeemer who is going to redeem him. At the climax of the story, after being questioned by Job, God finally speaks. But when he does speak in response to Job, he doesn't explain Job's suffering, much to maybe our frustration. In fact, Job never learns the reason for his suffering. Only we from the outside get to see that. Instead, God's response to Job's questions, God responds to him by showing him the universe. He takes him on a tour of the creation, the stars and the sea and the animals, even creatures beyond our knowledge. And he shows Job everything that he's created. And he asks, in a world as vast as this, how could Job ever fully understand why something happens to one person but not to another? Why one person appears to be blessed whereas another appears to be cursed? Such matters in some way, in other words, sit beyond Job's pay grade and by extension then ours too, which is really one of the main lessons of the book that Job conveys, that some things in life are simply beyond us to properly understand. Well, our reading today forms the centering climax of the story. And if you have your Bible still in front of you, I want us to just walk through the passage before we focus on the climactic words that are found in verse 23 to 27, which I'm sure resonated with you when you read them. The chapter before, chapter 18, ends with Job's friends giving him more of their supposed wisdom. And chapter 19 then begins with Job's reply to his friends. He says, "How long will you torment me and crush me with your words? 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. If it's true that I have gone astray, my error remains my concern alone." And then after this response to his friend, Job again turns to God in verse 7, and he says, "Though I cry violence, I get no response. Though I call out for help, there is no justice. He has blocked my way so I cannot pass. He has shrouded my paths in darkness. He has stripped me of my honor and removed the crown from my head. And when you read these words, you can hear the honesty of Job's cry to God. He's frustrated, right? He's disappointed. And perhaps you found yourself or you find yourself right now in a similar place where you're in trouble and you're crying out to God, but it seems that, like Job, you're getting no response from God. The heavens are silent to you. Or maybe on the other hand, you've been taught that these kinds of questions are not fit for a person to ask God, that it's not right to ever question God in this nature. But there's no indication in Job that such questions to God are not acceptable. Job's just honestly crying out to God, just like you do, and it seems fitting for him to do so in the moment. And your questions are likely fitting for God too. It's okay to cry out to God in this way. Well, in verse 13, Job turns again to his awful condition. And in verse 17, where the situation not so pitiful, I think we can all agree, maybe you laughed when you read it, that we find one of the most humorous verses in the entirety of Scripture, where in his crying out, he says, "My breath is offensive to my wife," which is just the greatest of laments. I'm sure that many wives can totally identify with Job's wife in this moment. My own probably included. I just love that. But then with his rotten breath, sadly as it is, Job arrives as this most beautiful climax of his faith, where he says in verse 23, he says, "Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead or engraved in rock forever." And of course, as we read them some 4,000 years later, we know that in some fashion, they were recorded in indelible ink for Job. And then he continues, "I know that my Redeemer lives and that in the end, he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh, I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes and not another. How my heart yearns within me." And as I pause there, it's a good thing that they were recorded, for rarely have words of such faith and such beauty ever been recorded or ever been heard. You can hear the faith, you can hear the yearning, the longing for God to come to him through every word that Job cries out here. He begins with these words, "I know," despite what his friends say, despite the boils on his skin, despite the heavens saying nothing in reply, despite his horrible breath, Job says, "I know." Where does such faith come from? How does he hold on to this faith in this moment? We're not told, but in the face of it all, he does have this faith to look back to God and say, "I know." And what is it that he knows? He says, "I know that my Redeemer lives." The Hebrew word for Redeemer is goel, and in the Israelite law, the Redeemer was a family member. It's a specific person, a family member who defended a relative's rights, who bought back property if it was taken from them, who avenged wrongs or secured justice on behalf of the other. Job has a Redeemer. "I know my Redeemer lives." And we're not told the Redeemer that Job has in mind, but it seems by the context to be God. Job knows, even though his cries to God seem unanswered in the moment, that God is his Redeemer, and that he's alive. He says, "My Redeemer lives." He lives. And more than lives, he says that this one will stand on the earth. That is, that what's being conveyed there is that he'll prevail in victory, standing in the world that has now brought Job such pain. The Redeemer lives. And in the midst of this chaos, Job says that the one who will avenge the wrongs of his life is alive, and he will stand in victory. That the future, in other words, is secure for Job. He has that. And you read that and you go, can we have that kind of faith, Job? To believe that it's true, that even though we too may be nothing but skin and bones, caught up in sickness of some variety or some difficulty, that we could know and know and know and know that our Redeemer lives and stands on the earth. That's really the wisdom of Job. It's to know that regardless of what is and what is around us, that there is a Redeemer who lives and that in the end he will stand. That's wisdom. And then in verse 26 and verse 27, he adds something that actually interpreters have a really difficult time interpreting and understanding and translating. He says that after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I will see him with my own eyes, Job says. Now, what's confusing about that expression is that for translators, the expression in my flesh, that it can be translated from Hebrew in two different ways. The NIV, which I've been quoting from here today, and which I usually do quote from, says, yet in my flesh I shall see God, which suggests that his body will be restored and that he will see God. But the NASB or the NARSV versions, they translate it the other way. They say, yet without my flesh, I will see God. And in this way, it translates or suggests that Job will see his redemption, but only after he dies, apart from his body, for whatever that means for him at that moment. Either way, there is this hope that his Redeemer will not abandon him to the grave, that in this life, or as the other translation seems to present, in the one to come, that Job is going to see God and that God is going to redeem him. His Redeemer lives. And then he finishes with these words, how my heart yearns within me. What words to finish with, but they're also words that are telling, the riches, comfort, and so-called blessings of these varieties. Though we long for these blessings more than anything else, rarely do these kinds of blessings produce the fruit that Job has here, the fruit of yearning. If anything, these things that we long for and that we yearn for are actually the things that make our hearts go dull and absent. But suffering and pain, even just the experience of aging, these are the things that make us yearn. And that when in pain, we yearn for the Redeemer. Our hearts and our minds quicken for him. This, more than anything else, makes us, like Job, yearn for God. There is a gift in this then. Let me finish then by turning us to Jesus. Many see in Job a foreshadowing of Jesus himself. Like Job, Jesus was also an innocent sufferer. He too was abandoned by his loved ones and accused by his friends. And like Job, Jesus was also vindicated after this experience of suffering, which is how the story ends for Job. But more than just foreshadowing, what we also need to see is that when Job cried these words, I know that my Redeemer lives, he didn't know that they would find their fulfillment in Jesus, but ultimately they do. Jesus, the prophets and the law and all the scriptures tell us that he is the true Redeemer who has come to Israel and through Israel has come into the world, that it is he, the scriptures teach us, that in the end will stand upon the earth. It is he whom we then long to see. It is he who has promised to deliver us out of our decay and even out of the decay of Jesus. The resurrection shows us the ultimate vindication. So whatever suffering you may be experiencing, maybe even right now as you watch this, or whatever suffering you may end up experiencing in the days ahead, because you most certainly will. The gift of Job is that it teaches us to have the faith of Job, to believe with Job that our Redeemer lives in the midst of these experiences, that he will stand on the earth, and that whatever may come to us, whether life or death, we have the assurance, because of his faithfulness to us, that we will see him. So we give thanks today, don't we, for this wisdom of 4,000 years, teaching us how we ought to live in this life and ought to approach these things like suffering. And my prayer for us all as we engage with this is that our hearts would find ourselves with Job yearning yearning in these days for God. Lord bless you.